I saw one old man going about the house with a walking stick. From here they had still 7 hours' journey to Bethlehem, but they did not take the direct route thither, because it was mountainous, and at this season too difficult. They followed the little she-ass across the country between Jerusalem and the Jordan. I saw them arrive about noon at a large shepherd's house, about 2 hours from John's place of baptism on the Jordan. Jesus once passed a night there after his baptism. Near the house was another for the farm and sheep utensils, and in the yard was a spring from which the water was conducted through pipes to the bathtubs. There was a large public house here, and numbers of servants who took their meals at it were going and coming. The host received the travelers very kindly, and he was very obliging. He insisted upon one of the servants washing Joseph's feet at the spring. He also supplied him with fresh garments while he aired and brushed those he took off. A maidservant rendered the same services to Mary. For the mistress of the house was backward in making her appearance. She lived retired. She is the same that Jesus afterward healed of a 30-year sickness. He told her that her malady had come upon her as a punishment for her want of hospitality toward his relatives. But I know the reason of her non-appearance to Mary and Joseph. She was young and rather frivolous. She had caught a glance of the Blessed Virgin, had spoken a word to her, perhaps, I do not now recall all the circumstances, and had conceived a feeling of jealousy on account of her beauty. It was for that reason that she kept herself secluded on this occasion. There were some children in the house. She is the same that Jesus afterward healed of a 30-year sickness. He told her that her malady had come upon her as a punishment for her want of hospitality toward his relatives. But I know the reason of her non-appearance to Mary and Joseph. She was young and rather frivolous. She had caught a glance of the Blessed Virgin, had spoken a word to her, perhaps, I do not now recall all the circumstances, and had conceived a feeling of jealousy on account of her beauty. It was for that reason that she kept herself secluded on this occasion. There were some children in the house. At their departure about noon, Mary and Joseph were accompanied part of the way by some of the people belonging to the inn. They proceeded westward toward Bethlehem, and arrived after a journey of about 2 hours at a little village consisting of a long row of houses, with gardens and courts lying on both sides of a broad highroad. Joseph had connections here, such as spring from the second marriage of a stepfather or stepmother. Their house was finely situated and very handsome, but Mary and Joseph did not enter. They passed through the place and went straight on toward Jerusalem for half an hour, when they came to a public house in which a crowd was gathered for a funeral. The frame partitions in the house had been removed from before the chimney and hearth. The fireplace was draped with black, and before it rested a coffin enveloped in the same somber hue. The male mourners wore long black robes with short white ones over them, and some had rough black maniples on their arms. All were praying. In another apartment sat the women, entirely enveloped in their large veils. There was in the yard a large fountain with several faucets. The proprietors of the house, who were taken up with the charge of the obsequies, left to the servants the duty of receiving Mary and Joseph. This was done accordingly, and the customary services rendered the holy travelers. Tapestry or mats were let down from the rollers near the ceiling, and a curtained space arranged for them. After some time, I saw the people of the house in conversation with them. The white garments had been laid aside. I saw a great many beds rolled up against the walls. They could be entirely separated from one another by means of the mats let down from the ceilings. Early the following morning, Mary and Joseph again started off. The good wife of the house told them they might stay, because Mary appeared in hourly expectation of her delivery. But Mary said with lowered veil that she had yet 6 or 8 and 30 hours. The woman was anxious to keep them, though not in her own house. I saw the husband, as Joseph and Mary were departing, talking to the former about his beasts. Joseph praised the ass very much, and told him that he had brought the other with him in case of necessity. When the people spoke of the difficulty of getting lodgings in Bethlehem, Joseph replied that he had friends there, and that Mary and he would certainly be well received. This made me feel so sorry. Joseph always spoke of this with so much confidence. I heard him again making the same remark to Mary on their way. It so happened on the last days of their journey, when they were nearing Bethlehem, that Mary sighed longingly for rest and refreshment. Joseph turned aside from the road for half an hour to a place where upon a former occasion he had discovered a beautiful fig tree laden with fruit. It had seats around it for weary wayfarers to rest upon. But when they reached it, they found, to their great disappointment, that it was at that time quite destitute of fruit. In after years, something connected with Jesus happened near that tree. It never more had fruit, though it continued green. Jesus cursed it, and it withered. The distance from the last public house to Bethlehem may have been 3 hours. Mary and Joseph went around by the north and approached the city on the west. A short distance outside the city, about a quarter of an hour's walk, brought them to a large building surrounded by courtyards and smaller houses. There were trees in front of it, and all sorts of people encamped in tents around it. This house was once the paternal home of Joseph, and ages before it had been the family mansion of David. It was at this period used as the custom house of the Roman taxes. Joseph still had in the city a brother who was an innkeeper. He was not his own brother, but a stepbrother. Joseph did not go near him. Joseph had had 5 brothers, 3 own brothers and 2 stepbrothers. Joseph was 45 years old. He was 30 years and, I think, 3 months older than Mary. He was thin, had a fair complexion, prominent cheekbones tinged with red, a high, open forehead, and a brownish beard. The little she-ass was not with them here. She had run away around the south side of the city, where it was somewhat level, a kind of valley. Joseph went straight into the custom house, for all newcomers had to present themselves there and obtain a ticket for entrance at the city gate. The city had properly no gate, but the entrance lay between 2 ruined walls that looked like the remains of a gate. Although Joseph was somewhat late in presenting himself for assessment, he was well received. Mary remained in a small house in the courtyard among the women, who were very attentive to her, and offered her something to eat. These women cooked for the soldiers. The latter were Romans, as I could tell by the straps hanging around their hips. The weather was lovely, not at all cold, the sun lighting up the mountain between Jerusalem and Bethania. One can see it very well from here. Joseph went up to a large room in an upper story where he was interrogated, who he was, etc., and his questioners examined long rolls of writing, numbers of which were hanging on the walls. They unrolled them and read to him his ancestry, also that of Mary. Joseph knew not before that through Joachim, Mary had descended in a straight line from David. The official asked him, "Where is thy wife?" For 7 years, the inhabitants of this part of the country were not regularly assessed, owing to various political troubles. I saw the numbers 5 and 2, and that certainly makes 7. The tax collecting had already been going on for many months, but 2 payments were still to be made. The people had to remain almost 3 months. They had indeed paid something here and there during those 7 years, but there had been no regular collection of taxes. Joseph did not pay anything on that first day, but his circumstances were inquired into. He told the official that he possessed no real estate, that he lived by his trade and the assistance of his wife's parents. Mary also was summoned to appear before the clerk, but not upstairs. She was interrogated in a passage on the first floor, and nothing was read to her. There were numbers of clerks and functionaries in the house. Scattered throughout the different rooms, and a great many Romans and soldiers were to be met in the upper stories. There were also Pharisees and Sadducees, priests and elders, and all sorts of clerks and officials of both Jewish and Roman extraction. There was no such payment of taxes going on in Jerusalem, but in many other places in Magdalum, on the Sea of Galilee, for instance, taxes were being received. The Galileans had to pay there, and the people from Sidon, too, partly on account of their commercial intercourse, I think. Only those that had no establishments, that possessed no estates, had to report at their birthplace. The receipts for the next 3 months were to be divided into 3 parts. The Emperor Augustus, Herod, and another king who dwelt in the neighborhood of Egypt had a share in them. The king near Egypt, having gained some advantage in war, had a claim upon a certain district far up the country. Consequently, they had to give him something. The second payment had some reference to the building of the temple. It was something like a payment on money advanced. The third was for the poor and for widows who had received nothing for a long time, but it all went, as such things do, in our own day. Little to the right man. Good reasons were easily found for its remaining in the hands of the great. Incessant writing and moving to and fro were kept up. Joseph then went with Mary straight to Bethlehem, on whose outskirts the houses stood scattered, and into the heart of the city. At the different streets they met, he left Mary and the ass standing while he went up and down in search of an inn. Mary often had to wait long before Joseph, anxious and troubled, returned. Nowhere did he find room. Everywhere was he sent away, and now it began to grow dark. Joseph at last proposed going to the other side of the city, where they would surely find lodgings. They proceeded down a street, which was more of a country road than a regular street, for the houses stood scattered along the hills, and at the end of it reached a low, level space or field. Here stood a very beautiful tree with a smooth trunk, its branches spreading out like a roof. Joseph let Mary and the beast under it, and there left them to go again in quest of an inn. He went from house to house, his friends of whom he had spoken to Mary unwilling to recognize him. Once, during his quest, he returned to Mary, who was waiting under the tree. He wept, and she consoled him. He started afresh on his search, but whenever he brought forward the approaching delivery of his wife as a pressing reason for receiving hospitality, he was dismissed. He was dismissed still more quickly. Meantime, it had grown dark. Mary was standing under the tree, her ungirdled robe falling around her in full folds, her head covered with a white veil. The ass was nearby, its head turned toward the tree, at the foot of which Joseph had made a seat for Mary with the baggage. Crowds were hurrying to and fro in Bethlehem, and many of the passers-by gazed curiously at Mary as one naturally does on seeing a person standing a long time in the dark. I think also that some of them addressed her and asked her who she was. Ah, they little dreamed that the Savior was so near. Mary was so patient, so tranquil, so full of hope. Ah, she had indeed longed to wait. At last she sat down, her hands crossed on her breast, her head lowered. After a long time, Joseph returned in great dejection. I saw that he was shedding tears, and, because he had failed again to find an inn, he hesitated to approach. But suddenly he bethought him of a cave outside Bethlehem, used as a storing place by the shepherds when they brought their cattle to the city. Joseph had often withdrawn thither to conceal himself from his brothers and to pray. It was very likely to be deserted at that season, or if any shepherds did come, it would be easy to make friends with them. He and Mary might there find shelter for a while, and after a little rest he would go out again on his search. And now they went around to the left as if through the ruined walls, tombs, and ramparts of a country town. They mounted a rampart or hill, and then the road began again to descend. At last they reached a hill before which stood trees, firs, pines, or cedars, and trees with small leaves like the box tree. In this hill was the cave or vault spoken of by Joseph. There were no houses around. One side of the cave was built up with rough masonry, through which the open entrance of the shepherds led down into the valley. Joseph opened the light wicker door, and as they entered, the she-ass ran to meet them. She had left them near Joseph's paternal house and had run around the city to this cave. She frolicked around and leaped gaily about them, so that Mary said, "Behold, it is surely God's will that we should be here." But Joseph was worried and, in secret, a little ashamed, because he had so often alluded to the good reception they would meet in Bethlehem. There was a projection above the door under which he stood the ass, and then proceeded to arrange a seat for Mary. It was quite dark. About 8 o'clock when they reached this place. Joseph struck a light and went into the cave. The entrance was very narrow. The walls were stuffed with all kinds of coarse straw, like rushes, over which hung brown mats. Back in the vaulted part were some air holes in the roof, but here also everything was in disorder. Joseph cleared it out and prepared as much space in the back part as would afford room for a couch and seat for Mary, who had seated herself on a rug with her bundle for a support. The ass was then brought in, and Joseph fastened a lamp on the wall. While Mary was eating, he went out to the field in the direction of the milk cave, and laid a leathern bottle in the rivulet that it might fill. He went also to the city, where he procured some little dishes, a bundle of other things, and I think some fruit. It was indeed the Sabbath, but on account of the numerous strangers in the city and their need of various necessaries, provisions and utensils were exposed for sale on tables placed at the street corners. The price was paid down on the spot. I think servants or pagan slaves guarded the tables, but I cannot remember for certain. When Joseph returned, he brought with him a small bundle of slender sticks beautifully bound up with reeds, and a box with a handle in which were glowing coals. These he poured out at the entrance of the cave to make a fire. He next brought the water bottle, which he had filled at the rivulet, and prepared some food. It consisted of a stew made of yellow corn, some kind of large plant that contained a great many seeds, and a little bread. After they had eaten and Mary had lain down to rest upon her rush couch, over which was spread a cover, Joseph began to prepare his own resting place at the entrance of the cave. When this was done, he went again into the city. Previously to setting out, he had stopped up all the openings of the cave in order to keep out the air. Then for the first time I saw the Blessed Virgin on her knees in prayer, after which she lay down upon the carpet on her side, her head resting on her arm, her bundle serving for a pillow. This cave lay at the extremity of the mountain ridge of Bethlehem. A clump of beautiful trees stood in front of the entrance, and thence could be descried some of the towers and roofs of the city. Over the entrance, which was closed by a door made of wickerwork, was a shed. From the door a moderately wide passage led into the cave, an irregularly formed vault, half round, half triangular. On one side of the passage was a recess rather lower than the general surface, and this Joseph had enclosed by curtains for his own sleeping place. The rest of the passage from the recess to the entrance he cut off by hangings, and there had a kind of storeroom. The passage was not so lofty as the cave itself, which was vaulted by nature. The inner walls of the cave, where they were formed entirely by nature, though not perfectly even, yet were pleasing and clean. Indeed, to my eye, there was something about them quite charming. They pleased me more than did those parts upon which some attempts had been made at masonry, for these latter were coarse and rough. The foundation of the right side of the entrance appeared for some distance to have been hewn out of the rock. Only the upper part seemed to have been made by the hand of man. There were also some holes in this passage. In the middle of the vaulted roof was an opening, and, I think, 3 others cut obliquely halfway up the same. These oblique openings presented a smoother appearance than the topmost one. They looked like the handiwork of man. The floor of the cave was deeper than that of the entrance, and was on 3 sides surrounded by a stone seat somewhat raised, broad in some places, in others narrow. At one of the broad parts the ass took its stand. It had no trough, but a large leathern bag was placed before it or hung in the corner. Behind was a small side cave, just large enough to allow the animal to stand upright. There the fodder was stored. A gutter ran along by this corner, and I saw Joseph cleaning the cave out every day. Where Mary reposed before the birth of the child, and where I beheld her elevated above the ground at the moment of her delivery, there was a similar seat of stone. The spot in which the crib stood was a deep recess or side vault. Near it was a second entrance into the cave, which was in the ridge of a hill that ran toward the city. In the rear, the hill sank into a very charming valley, planted with rows of trees. This valley led to the suckling cave of Abraham, situated in a projection of the opposite hill. The valley may have been 1/8 of an hour in width, and through it flowed that little rivulet from which Joseph had procured the water. Beside the real crib cave, there were in the same hill, but lying somewhat deeper, 2 other caves, in one of which the Blessed Virgin often remained hidden. When in after years St. Paula laid the first foundation of her convent at Bethlehem, I saw a small, lightly built chapel erected in the valley and on the east side of the cave. It was so constructed as to be contiguous to the rear of the crib cave and directly back of the spot upon which Jesus was born. This little chapel of wood and wicker walls was hung inside with tapestry. 4 rows of cells opened into it, which were built as lightly as the shepherd's cots generally are in Palestine. In every row were separate cells, each surrounded by its own little garden, and all connected by covered passages, leading to the chapel. Here Paula and her daughter gathered around them their first companions. In the chapel and free from the wall stood an altar with its little tabernacle, Behind it hung a red and white silk curtain, which concealed the facsimile of the crib cave that St. Paula had caused to be made. It was separated from the real cave, from the exact spot upon which Jesus was born, only by the rocky wall. This crib was made of white stone and was a faithful imitation of that of Jesus. The manger also was represented, and even the hay hanging through its sides. The infant in it was likewise of white stone and closely swathed in a blue veil. The figure was hollow and not very heavy. I saw St. Paula often taking it up into her arms while she prayed. Upon the wall over this crib hung a banner upon which was represented the ass, with its head turned toward the crib. It was embroidered in colors and the hair made of thread, so natural that it looked like real hair. Above the crib was a hole in which a star was fastened. I saw that the child Jesus often appeared here to St. Paula and her daughter. In front of the curtains and right and left of the altar were hanging lamps. I saw Joseph on the following day arranging a seat and couch for Mary in the so-called suckling cave of Abraham, which was also the sepulchre of Maraha, his nurse. It was more spacious than the cave of the crib. Mary remained there some hours, while Joseph was making the latter more habitable. He brought also from the city many different little vessels and some dried fruits. Mary told him that the birth hour of the child would arrive on the coming night. It was then 9 months since her conception by the Holy Ghost. She begged him to do all in his power that they might receive as honorably as possible this child promised by God, this child supernaturally conceived, and she invited him to unite with her in prayer for those hard-hearted people who would afford him no place of shelter.